I finally played Okami here in 2025. Honestly, it feels strange to admit it's taken me this long. If you follow my channel, this might be equally surprising to you as well. You see, on paper, Okami is the perfect game for me. A highly artistic action-adventure experience originally from the mid-2000s on the PS2, one of my favorite consoles and my favorite decade of gaming. At the time, Okami promised an adventure comparable to other ambitious artistic classics like Wind Waker or Shadow of the Colossus. Now, I don't really have a good excuse for never having played this game, so with the recent announcement of the Okami sequel, I realized it was finally time to sit down and play through this acclaimed title, specifically the HD release on Switch. Okami has stellar Metacritic scores, and the general consensus online seems to be that it's amazing, with some even going as far as to call it one of the best games of all time. Well, after the credits for Okami HD finally rolled, I had a surprisingly hard time painting a picture of my final opinion of the game, so I decided to make this video. I want to offer my thoughts on this classic as a fresh perspective from someone who has never played it. In many ways, Okami was about what I expected, and I mean that in a good way. But there were also many aspects of the game that surprised me, both good and bad, and I think some of those surprises offer an interesting commentary on the modern gaming industry. Please consider hitting those subscribe and like buttons if you enjoy this content, and let's dive in. So let's get the obvious out of the way. Okami is generally a great game. You play as the wolf incarnation of the sun god on an adventure to thwart evil spirits with the help of a tiny annoying companion named Isun or Isun. The adventure unfolds through a unique and beautiful watercolor painting art style. The visuals are a testament to this idea that strong art direction is timeless and always wins over pure technical horsepower, though there's plenty of that here as well for the time. I think Okami also perfectly illustrates an idea that I discuss frequently on my channel, which is that 6th generation games scale incredibly well to HD remasters with minimal effort. Games from this generation were colorful and alive and interactive, and simply bumping up the resolution and cleaning up some textures or visual elements creates wonders. Now, Okami's gameplay is clearly inspired by other series such as The Legend of Zelda, but Okami brings plenty of its own innovations to the picture. The key gameplay hook is the Celestial Brush, a paintbrush that lets you use strokes to interact with the world around you. For the most part, the mechanic works surprisingly well once you get the hang of it, and still feels fresh and innovative almost 20 years later. There are occasionally frustrating moments, but overall it adds depth and interest to the combat and has a way of making the world around you feel more interactive, like you're actually manipulating a living painting at times. I think Okami is a shining example of how sometimes older, more retro games actually feel more interactive in terms of gameplay than many modern counterparts. Older games with less realistic art styles and mechanics didn't have to worry about breaking immersion, and so they were able to prioritize dynamic interactivity and unique ideas. This feeling of interactivity extends to many elements of the world around you beyond just the celestial brush. Okami feels alive in ways most games fail to achieve, including many of today's overly static environments. Flowers and plants spring up as your character runs around or defeats enemies. Cleansing the world around you produces wonderful transitions that highlight the beauty of nature. There's visible wind and petals billowing about you, day and night cycles, changing environments, lively characters with plenty to say, beautiful water, and plenty of interesting gameplay scenarios throughout. This world is also a great example of one of my favorite characteristics of older games, which is that everything in the world feels intentional and handcrafted. Every path, tree, and structure feels like it has a reason to be there or adds to the experience somehow and was intentionally put there by a designer. Many more modern games often feel like they have endless generic landscapes that serve no purpose other than to create space for checklists of to-dos and often lack personality. The intentionality of design here is very refreshing. There are so many creative scenarios that are only possible due to this handcrafted nature of the environments. The overworld and total size of the game is large enough to create a sense of adventure without being pointlessly huge. I'm almost glad I waited this long to play Okami because in many ways they just don't make games like this anymore, and so to me, this was like a new yet classic experience in 2025. Ever since the major 3D Zelda games moved to the Breath of the Wild format, We really don't have that many major 3D franchises that still follow the retro action-adventure dungeon-solving structure. Okami proves that formula still works wonderfully well today, and I wish more games would innovate and expand on this timeless structure. There's something inherently rewarding about transitioning between world-building adventure gameplay and tighter puzzle or action-focused dungeons. Okami dungeons rarely reach the complexity of anything in the Zelda series, but they do add their own twist with a stronger focus on platforming and action, which gives the game its own unique pacing and feel. This formula also produces an appealing game size and length. The main quest is around 20 hours long the first time if you stay focused on the main quest, and then maybe another few hours of side activities. I personally really enjoy this size of game. I think it allows for quality over quantity in terms of gameplay. It's long enough to feel like a meaningful investment in a world, but short enough that you can definitively beat and even replay the game if you enjoy it. I wish more games nowadays stayed in this 15 to 20 hour length rather than the endless play it until you get bored approach we often see today. One element of Okami that I enjoyed more than I thought I would is the combat. The game transitions to small arena-style zones when you engage in combat with enemies. You're still able to run and jump and dash and use the Celestial Brush during combat, which gives things sort of a loose, chaotic feel, but it all still comes together fairly well. The enemies are rarely difficult, but there's enough variety and things to try in your toolbox that it mostly remains enjoyable for the length of the game. There are also some interesting boss fights that make good use of the brush mechanics. The story of Okami is also interesting enough, even if it is sort of typical RPG action-adventure good versus evil. The beautiful visuals and Japanese art style really help to sell the tale and bring the adventure alive. Since I never played this when it was originally released, I'm not sure that this story will ever have much nostalgic or sentimental value to me over time, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. Now, there are a few areas where I was left underwhelmed or felt like the experience became a little bit tedious. Although I enjoyed the story and characters, I do think that the game sometimes has overly long exposition dumps or very lengthy conversations that could have been greatly streamlined without losing any of the content or charm. Towards the end of the game, I think the story also becomes needlessly convoluted with time travel elements and some overly long segments that hurt the pacing. Isun, your annoying miniature companion, also really started to wear on me at times with constant interruptions and always being in a bad mood and rambling and yelling at people. Occasionally this was humorous or amusing, but overall he talks way too much and is generally annoying. There's also a recurring attempt at humor through the conversations between Isun and certain female characters that ends up very cringe or uncomfortable. This inappropriate harassment dialogue just feels tone-deaf or awkward, especially for a game targeted at a wide audience that includes younger players. There are some other wider pacing issues as well beyond the story or dialogue. Some stretches of gameplay have frequent interruptions about obvious things, sort of like Navi from Ocarina of Time, though often much worse. The beginning of the game also takes quite a while to really get going beyond a simple village, which reminded me of the first few hours of Twilight Princess from the Zelda series. Most dialogue in the HD version can be fast-scrolled if you're a quick reader, but at times Okami takes away this option and scrolls text very slowly, which can cause scenes to drag on. Characters also don't have voice acting, but rather an Animal Crossing-style mumbling jargon, which I have mixed feelings about. In some ways it gives characters more personality than no voice acting, but other times it sounds overly MIDI or kind of annoying to listen to for extended periods. I almost wish they had taken more of a Zelda approach to this, where they use the vocal bits sparingly to give you an idea of what the character sounds like, but not play these noises constantly during long conversations. Okami also does suffer a little bit from a common retro game design flaw, which is thinly disguised fetch quests or padding segments. Some of the side quest content also just relies on endless, sort of meaningless collectathons. For the most part, Okami does have engaging scenarios for the main quest, but there were a few segments between the more memorable sequences where I thought things became a bit tedious. I would have preferred the game be a couple hours shorter and further streamlined. I think there are also some balancing issues with the combat. The game is overly generous with money and drops, which lets you acquire all kinds of powerful items to make the combat even easier. With most enemy encounters, I felt like I could just spam attacks and use a few items and an occasional brush stroke and win without any real challenge. I never even came close to dying once the entire adventure. So although I really enjoyed Okami, I do have to admit that when the credits rolled, overall I struggled a bit in deciding how I would rank this game against other classics. Part of me feels like I should absolutely love this game, but for some reason overall I only ended up liking it, and I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe there weren't enough characters that I found to be truly memorable or endearing. Or maybe the dungeons and puzzles were good but not amazing. Perhaps the pacing issues bothered me more than I realize. For whatever reason, I just don't think that years from now I'll feel quite as attached to this game the same way I do with other classics, even though I think it's a high quality experience. Part of this might have to do with expectations. As I mentioned earlier, I've sometimes seen this game described as one of the greatest of all time, and that's part of what encouraged me to finally play it, but I don't think I'm quite there on this one, even though I did enjoy it. I thought it was a creative experience with a wonderful art style, but usually when I finish an incredible game, I feel the urge to replay it or explore every last corner it has to offer, and I didn't experience that here. For whatever reason, Okami doesn't feel quite as memorable or replayable as other classic adventures from around that time. Perhaps it's because I played it so many years later as an adult that I don't have that nostalgic attachment, or maybe it just isn't quite on that same level. Regardless, I'm still glad I played it, and I'll absolutely play the sequel. Because of my indecisiveness, I'm very curious to hear what all of you think about this game, or how you would rank it, because I feel so internally conflicted. So please hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed this content, leave a comment with your thoughts about Okami, and let's discuss.